right, we're going to get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Nick Kaza and I work on energy and sustainability programs at the National League of Cities. Today we are going to explore some tools that can help communities plan for and deploy solar energy. Joining us today, we have two very knowledgeable speakers from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Megan Day leads research, analysis, and technical assistance on municipal energy planning and policy, utility-scale solar development, and integrating solar in local land use and zoning codes. Alexandra Aznar is a project leader that works on subnational clean energy and climate change policies and provides technical assistance to state and local policymakers. Before we get started with the presentations, I'd like to review some webinar details. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the SolSmart website within the next few days. All attendees are muted and will be throughout the webinar. After our speakers have concluded their presentations, we will have time for a brief Q&A. Please submit questions to the organizer through the question feature in GoToWebinar, or you can email me at kaza@nlc.org, kaza@nlc.org. All right, before we get started on the actual presentations and a little bit of background, we're just going to do a couple of poll questions to get a good understanding of the communities and who else is on the webinar today. So I'm going to launch our first poll question. You can almost call this one a practice one, but it's still a good question. And let me see. Megan and Alex, can you see the polling question?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so we'll give it a minute there while folks answer the question, and I will share it momentarily. Okay, so our first question is, does your community have clean energy or carbon reduction goals? We have almost 80% of the participants have voted, and the response rate is just over 70% yes and 30% no. So with that, I'm going to close our first poll and share our next poll. So we're going to get a little more specific here. Does your community already have solar installed on municipal buildings? Okay, fantastic. We actually have very high voter turnout. This is great to see. This is almost a 50-50 split. We have about 52% that are saying yes, they already do, and about 48% that do not. I'm going to close this poll and bring up another one, which kind of builds off the original two. And this one is your community considering installing either solar energy for the first time or more solar energy on municipal buildings? Okay, great. Thank you for your participation. That one is a resounding 82% yes and 18% no. Let me see here. Okay, that is all our polling questions for now. Let me lead in and talk a little bit more about our webinar today. So our webinar is brought to you by the SolSmart program. SolSmart is jointly managed by the Solar Foundation and ICMA. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the National League of Cities both support the SolSmart program. SolSmart provides assistance to enhance local solar markets, making it easier and more affordable for homes and businesses to install and access solar energy. The program also promotes local jobs, helps communities achieve their climate and energy goals, and improves internal processes to be more efficient and well-defined. SolSmart is funded from the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technology Office. We have a goal of designating 300 SolSmart communities by October of 2020. We're well on our way to that goal, and hopefully we'll be able to achieve it at least a year early. SolSmart has two main components. The first is a designation. It's very similar to LEED in that way. We have a criteria with individual credits and varying points from 5 to 20 with several prerequisites as well. And we use that criteria to assess a local government solar processes. They can then be designated at a bronze, silver, or gold level. Recognizing that not all communities are necessarily solar experts or have well-defined solar processes and transparent policies, we also provide technical assistance to help communities either achieve an initial step of designation or to achieve a higher level of designation. Here's a map of the geographic distribution of designees. Currently, we have communities designated in 38 states. As I had mentioned, we're actually well on our way to 300. We have over 250 designees right now, so the race is on to see who will be number 300. So the SolSmart program aims to help communities reduce soft costs. Some of you may have heard that term before. Others of you may be asking yourself, well, what are soft costs? Well, those are anything that's not the physical hardware of a solar array. So the physical hardware, you have the panels, the inverters, the racking, other components that make up the balance of systems. That's not soft costs. Those are hard costs. Soft costs are what we have some examples of on the slide right here. For permitting inspection, we have the cost and the time involved in these processes. There could also be zoning barriers to deploying solar energy on a home or business. That could take time and money to overcome and resolve. Many residents will want to access financing for a solar investment, another source of time and expense, and sometimes frustration as well. Solar installers must deal with attracting customers and then having a trained and very reliable workforce to install solar as well. These are all examples of solar soft costs, and as you can see, local governments actually have a big influence in reducing soft costs in these areas, either directly through staff training or ordinance updates, or indirectly through collaboration with partners. Before I go to the next slide, we're actually going to do another polling question, basically asks, what are the biggest barriers to more solar energy in your community? And this is a multi-pick list question, so you can pick one or several, depending on what the barriers are for you. Okay, thank you all for your participation. So our top three are actually availability of financing. That's probably no surprise to anyone. Residents that are well informed about solar energy is the number 2 barrier, and number 3 is state policy. So we see that soft costs definitely can impact the overall cost of solar. So that's one of the reasons why SolSmart is here to try and address these different types of soft costs. I'm going to close the poll and move on. So I did mention the SolSmart criteria. These are just a couple of the credits that we have within the criteria. Overall, it's made up of 8 categories and about 95 different credits. These are examples of ones that National Renewable Energy Laboratory can provide assistance on to communities. And there's a couple here that are specifically geared towards understanding the feasibility of solar energy on facilities. So in this case, municipal facilities. I'm going to go to one more poll, I believe, and then turn it over to our speakers. So here's our latest poll question. And it's just basically asking those in the audience, what level of interest do you have, or are you interested in pursuing any of these criteria? Okay, and this was another multi-pick list question, and actually each one of these has over 55% that folks are interested in, so kind of a resounding interest in all of these different categories. Number one is actually the PZD 3A, reviewing planning docs and documents and understanding how we could integrate solar into those planning goals. So definitely something that SolSmart obviously does. I actually completed a review and helped the community with that earlier today. So if you are interested in that, definitely get in touch after the webinar. With that, I'm going to close this poll and turn it over to our speakers. One moment as I shift presenter mode. There we go. Okay, Alex, turn the controls over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. As Nick mentioned, my name is Alexandra Asnar, and I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And we're going to speak today about some of the tools and data available to assess solar in your community. So the tools and data that we'll be sharing today have several factors in common. First, they provide users insight on solar technologies, and they were developed by the U.S. Department of Energy or DOE national laboratories, such as NREL. They are publicly available and free to users, such as yourselves, and some are accessible via API, as the goal for most tools and data is to be open source. And that means that these are not quote-unquote black box proprietary tools that produce results for which you have little insight into the inputs. So even if NREL uses a tool to complete an analysis for you, which is possible under the technical assistance offered through the SolSmart program, you'd still be able to manipulate the tool and recreate results yourself. This slide provides a summary of the tools and data that we'll discuss in more detail during the webinar today. Some of the key features we'll highlight are the type of user or audience the tool is for, the types of questions the tool can answer, the types of training available, and whether the tool or data is open source or not. We want to empower you today to play around with and use these tools, but as a reminder, as part of the SolSmart program, technical assistance is available for communities. So depending on your need, NREL or others can use these tools on your behalf to answer key solar questions for your community. So the first data and tool we'll highlight today is the National Solar Radiation Database, or NSRDB. And the NSRDB is a collection of meteorological and solar irradiance data for the U.S., and we also have some international locations, such as South Asia, Mexico, and Central America included in this data set. The NSRDB provides hourly and sub-hourly solar resource data at sufficient locations and temporal and spatial scales that one can see the amount of solar energy available at any given time and location anywhere in the U.S. NREL has provided this solar resource data for the U.S. through the NSRDB for over 25 years. And you can access and see this data through the data viewer. And I have a screenshot of that on the left side of this slide. This resource provides users information about the level of solar irradiance at a site, which is a key factor in determining optimal locations for solar installations. For developers, engineers, and energy planners, this information is critical for decision making. And as you'll see later in the webinar, the NSRDB data is a foundational input to other mapping tools and PV system performance and economic models, such as SAM or PV Watts. So I encourage you to explore the links highlighted here to learn more and access the variety of training resources available for this tool. Other more tailored solar mapping and data tools have been built off of the foundational solar resource data provided by the NSRDB, the tool I just discussed. And three important ones developed by NREL are the ReAtlas, the Tribal Energy Atlas, and the Solar for All tool. The ReAtlas allows users to see solar resource data as well as other renewable energy technologies resource data, such as hydropower, wind, and geothermal, again through a data viewer. In this way, a user can see and understand which renewable energy technologies are optimal at specific sites. There is also an option to download the data and do queries on specific regions. The Tribal Energy Atlas provides similar solar and other RE resource data, but focuses on tribal lands. In addition, it includes other types of data such as energy infrastructure location, environmental attributes, and energy expenditures, for example. You can see a map of the utility scale PV potential within tribal lands or within 10 miles of tribal lands, for example, on the top half of this slide. The Solar for All tool similarly uses NSRDB solar data, but it focuses on low and moderate, or LMI, communities in the U.S. So the map in the lower half of this slide, for example, displays the solar rooftop technical potential in LMI communities at the county level. Solar for All also provides data on energy expenditures, energy burden, demographics, and health indicators, all metrics that may also be of interest for people designing energy efficiency and renewable energy programs or policies targeted at LMI households and communities. The Solar for All tool was featured in more detail in a previous SolSmart webinar on solar for low-income communities, so I encourage you to go watch that recorded webinar or use the links featured here to learn more about that tool.
Hi, so this is Megan Day, also with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I'll be talking a little bit about the State and Local Energy Data Site. This is a site developed over the last 6 or 7 years, where we've compiled data on state and local energy, obviously. We include it here in the solar webinar because there is modeled small building rooftop PV potential for every single U.S. city, and so that is 23,400 and more cities where we've modeled this data. And so you can also find rooftop PV potential data for all buildings, or a good percentage of buildings, from Google Project Sunroof Data Explorer. It's another option to consider. Also on Sled, you have data that's modeled for electricity and natural gas consumption and expenditures, on-road vehicle gasoline and diesel consumption within each U.S. city, vehicle miles traveled within each city, and things like building stock by area, count, and type. So there you may be able to find some data to help you with some solar planning as far as rooftop PV. We also have data on commercial building energy disclosure potential impact, housing types by income, and a summary of greenhouse gas emissions for on-road vehicle fuel consumption and electricity and natural gas consumption for each city. So a lot of data there, but again, it does feature small building rooftop PV potential modeled for each city. That is basically buildings, residential buildings, could be used as a proxy for the sort of residential sector because it's a footprint of 5,000 square feet or smaller. Given the data available, we were kind of limited to small building modeling for that. So the next tool that is publicly available and heavily used here is PV Watts. And PV Watts is kind of the workhorse of our public solar tools and is the engine or the calculator behind a lot of other tools, much like the NSRDB. So PV Watts is really easy to use. It provides an analysis or calculation of how much generation you could get based on your location and the type of installation, whether it's roof mounted or single axis tracking. And you can actually even draw a system size and in a particular location on a map through PV Watts, and it will generate the associated capacity that you could fit within that shape and the generation from that kind of a capacity in that location. So I actually use PV Watts a lot as a simple metric. So I just enter in 1 kilowatt, for example, of roof-mounted PV in a particular location, and then I can multiply that by as many kind of kilowatts as I think might be installed under different scenarios, or 1 megawatt, and understand the associated annual generation for that size capacity of a system. So I encourage you to use PV Watts if you have not already. It's a great, simple to use tool. Now we're moving on to the System Advisor model. SAM, as it's otherwise known, uses PV Watts as the calculator that's sort of feeding into this tool. So what you get is not just the generation as you do from PV Watts, but you have a full financial model through SAM. And it's populated with all kinds of default values, like the efficiency and particular module types and inverter types. So it can provide a very detailed cost model with the cost dollars per watt for the capacity, as well as dollars per kilowatt hour generated, and things like your first year power purchase agreement or PPA pricing, with or without an escalator. It's a very robust tool that is pretty complex, but there's a lot of defaults. And there's also now a battery storage component that you can work on in SAM and combine it with PV or any other of the different kinds of generation technologies that you see here on this slide. So CSP and wind, etc. I've actually used SAM not knowing much about wind siting, and I've looked at it to say, okay, I have 80 acres in this location. How many wind turbines might that fit, and what kind of generation could you see? So it's a really useful tool for that kind of rough approximation to get some sense of your generation potential and the financial models. So SAM, however, is pretty sensitive to different kinds of defaults, right? So if you're particularly using it for a larger system modeling, you want to be careful not to just take the financial outputs at face value. SAM has hundreds of different kinds of specific technologies and system components, like different types of module manufacturers and et cetera. And it has the associated pricing, but this is obviously based on recent pricing. And so if you're looking at a model for a future build, particularly large scale that might be like 2 years out, it's not going to capture those either economies of scale or the associated decreases in the costs for technologies, module components, etc. So you want to take that with a grain of salt and maybe look at some other data that you can input for projected pricing and make sure that you're kind of within market range so that you don't think things are going to be much more expensive than they will be moving into the future. But I use it a lot for large-scale PV modeling and in different locations, and to try to create some different parameters that I can play with to understand the impacts of sort of different leasing rates, etc. I've also used it for community scale or shared solar, and it's used quite a bit here at NREL to provide technical assistance through the SolSmart program. So we have run System Advisor model analyses for Wood County, Wisconsin and Whitefish, Montana, for example, and help them understand the generation potential and financial parameters of different sized systems for these SolSmart participants.
The next tool we'll talk about is the Community Solar Scenario Tool. And this tool was created by NREL with small municipal utilities, electric cooperatives, and state and local advocates in mind. It's an Excel-based tool that provides a first-cut analysis of community solar projects. And if you're unfamiliar with community solar or shared solar, this concept was explored in a previous SolSmart webinar, and a recording of that can be found on solsmart.org. So in this tool, you can see how various inputs, such as system size, location, and project cost, impact economics from both a customer perspective and a utility perspective. This tool can help communities evaluate the applicability of a community solar project. But please note that the tool is still in a beta version and it's not a finished product, and we welcome feedback from the community solar users and community for this tool. The next tool I want to talk about is called RealFlight. RealFlight is a publicly available tool, no-cost tool, and it allows users to evaluate the economics of grid-connected solar, wind, and battery storage at a particular site. It allows you to identify the system sizes and the battery dispatch strategies required to minimize a site's energy costs. And in addition to these economic results, RealFlight helps users understand the resilience benefits of a PV or wind system paired with battery storage. It can estimate how long a system can sustain critical load during a grid outage. Users can enter information about the site, utility, load profiles, and financial metrics, and this information can be specific to a site, or default options and simulations are available if you don't have that specific information. And RealFlight is a subset of NREL's full model called ReOpt capabilities that optimizes energy systems for buildings, campuses, and communities. And the full model is not publicly available at this time, but we've seen a lot of recent interest from SolSmart communities, particularly those focused on resilience planning, in understanding the economics and resilience benefits of PV paired with battery storage, particularly for critical infrastructure in those communities. And through the SolSmart program, we've worked with several communities to understand if solar and storage makes economic sense at a particular site. And this is an example of the technical support that can be offered through the program. And it sounds like many of you on the webinar today are considering solar and are considering solar and battery storage. So RealFlight might be a useful tool for you to get a sense of the economics of those systems and the types of resiliency benefits they could provide to some of your sites.
Okay, so moving on to the Building Energy Optimization Tool, or BEOPT. This is a tool for residential building analysis, and so it can accommodate either single family or up to fourplex residential buildings. And it is software that is not open source, but it is fully downloadable. And it provides capabilities to evaluate residential buildings by design and identify cost-optimal energy efficiency packages at various levels of whole house energy savings. So I've recently used this here at NREL. We've used it for modeling both a low-cost scenario, lowest cost, highest energy savings, as well as a zero net energy scenario. And so BEOPT provides detailed simulation-based analysis based on specific house characteristics. So you can enter in, if it's an existing house, things like the size, the orientation, architecture, occupancy, vintage, location, and utility rates. And it looks at discrete envelope and equipment options reflecting realistic construction materials and practices. So basically, it's going to take thousands of different combinations of energy conservation measures and run the analysis to look at where is that cost curve lowest for the highest efficiency. And so when we recently applied this to, it was like an 1800s building, and we wanted to look at, based on the baseline situation versus all the energy efficiency interventions that we could consider. It then, for the net zero scenario, we include it here because it takes the net zero scenario, the most efficient kind of building or housing type you can create, and then it generates the associated PV that would be required to meet the remaining energy consumption. So for this example, it was an 1800s house, really inefficient. We did a baseline where we assumed kind of the least efficient HVAC system versus the most efficient, of course. And it looked at, it picked mini split heat pump, interestingly, as the most cost effective and the most efficient HVAC system, plus all kinds of things like wall insulation levels and different types of obviously LED lighting. And then it said, okay, with this lowest or highest efficiency model, you then need 8 kilowatts of PV. And so then you can look at, can you fit 8 kilowatts of PV on that roof, or maybe there needs to be a ground mount system or something to actually achieve net zero. And there it might be best to use a different kind of tool. You can do a quick analysis with PV watts, a more financial analysis with SAM, or do some other sort of siting analyses through Aurora or other programs to actually site and try to figure out rooftop configurations on that specific residential building. So that is ReAplas and the ReAplas tool.
Now we'll turn it over to you, Nick.
All right, thank you both very much. I'm going to take back presenter control. Let me make sure I'm showing the slides again. Let's see here. Yep, looks good. So real quick, actually, before we move on, we're going to do 2 more poll questions. The first is, actually, that's not true. We're going to do 3. The first is about the Sled tool. So it's just on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely would you be to use the Sled tool? And I will let Megan or Alex give you a quick, like 30 to 45 second refresher of what Sled would do or could do.
Sure. So the State and Local Energy Data Site, or SLED, is a site where we've compiled 26 different charts and tables with specific city and state level data, and either modeled or measured for 23,400 plus cities. And so you can find things like energy consumption and expenditure data, a modeled, very abbreviated emissions summary, and things like the small building rooftop PV potential.
So it sounds like that would be a pretty good starter tool for some of these communities that have established clean energy goals or are looking to establish clean energy goals. That would kind of be a nice little library that they could go to find some data about their community.
Exactly. To understand maybe what the potential of small buildings are to help achieve your goal, or what the built environment looks like and where energy efficiency interventions might be most helpful. For example, we have what are the highest electricity and natural gas consuming industries in each city. So there you might look at, those might be good options for PV on rooftops or other efficiency interventions.
Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm going to close that poll and move on to our next one, which is very similar. Rather than asking about SLED, though, it's asking about the SAM tool, System Advisory Model. And so, Megan and or Alex, how have you seen, you had mentioned Wood County and Whitefish, how have you seen other communities utilize SAM? Are they looking at, one specific building? Is it a cluster of buildings that are municipally owned? What have you seen communities use SAM for?
Sure. So SAM is used primarily for single sites or multiple, small groups of sites on an individual basis. So we'd run a separate model. I think ReAplas is probably a better tool, ReApLight, to look at a whole suite of buildings. So we've actually applied ReApt for like 42 different municipal buildings, I believe, for the city of Chicago, where we've used SAM for looking at some ground-mounted systems and a smaller sort of cohort of buildings. So they are overlapping in some ways in their capabilities, but SAM is great for looking at specific types of system configurations and building out those financial models.
Okay,
Exactly.
great.
I'll just add
Go ahead,
it's been useful for some communities to look at whether it makes financial sense for them to deploy these systems through a direct purchase or to use a power purchase agreement if available, given their state policy. So like Megan said, we look at some of the different financial models and scenarios and provide information that can help prioritize the buildings that you might want to deploy solar on, and it can help inform a RFP, for example.
Okay, excellent. One more poll question here, but actually before we get to that poll question, while we're on the SAM tool, what does the output look like from SAM? So, put the numbers in, it's run. What output does a user receive, and what could they do with that type of information? You just kind of mentioned an RFP potentially, but just kind of broadly speaking.
Sure. So you get all kinds of cool charts and tables as a result of your SAM run. One of which is, of course, generation over the course of the year. You also get revenues and expenditures over the life of the system. And you get things like the net present value, the levelized cost of energy, the cost per watt installed, and the cost per kilowatt hour for that associated generation, the first year PPA price, all kinds of outputs for SAM, possibly overwhelmingly multiple outputs. But it's a great tool.
Okay, excellent. Last question. Last poll question, I should say, is kind of more along the lines of asking about ReApt, but is your community discussing the issue of resilience and possibly energy storage?
So again, here we've got the ReApt and the SAM tools that can model PV plus storage at different scales. So both tools that you can use for this.
Okay, perfect. Got a lot of votes coming in here, and it looks like it's about a 60-40 split. 60% saying yes, they are discussing the issue of resilience and possibly energy storage. I'm going to close out this poll right now. Have just a couple of more slides to go before we get to questions. Okay, so did want to make an announcement about some SolSmart Innovation Awards. This is new for 2019, and we're currently accepting awards that are due by July 19th. And it's basically to recognize communities that have gone kind of above and beyond the SolSmart criteria. So, like I said, we have about 95 different credits that are actions a community could implement to really promote solar energy development and growth within their community. We're looking for those unique instances that may go above and beyond what the SolSmart criteria has. Also potentially just unique examples of solar paired with other technologies. Could be something as simple as solar plus storage for resiliency. Maybe you've combined solar and EV charging at multiple locations within your community. Whatever it might be, we're welcoming communities to submit for the SolSmart Innovation Award that will be presented at the ICMA conference in October. It's going to be in Nashville, Tennessee, so be a fun city to attend. If you are interested, we have an email at the bottom for Nay Shah at Home Innovation. You can send him an email. You could also send me an email, and I'll make sure that it gets to the right individuals as well. So with that, we will go to questions. Like I said, you can send me an email, or you can submit it through the question panel. And I saw a really great question come through, and I want to make sure I ask this one. Could the speakers talk about how communities that have been engaged with SolSmart are using these tools and kind of what steps are involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So when we're working with communities, as Nick mentioned, there are a variety of different SolSmart criteria, and so communities can work on several different activities at once. If a community expresses interest, as many of you have today, that you have these clean energy goals, or you're considering how solar can help you get to your clean energy goals, or if you have questions about solar and storage, we typically have a conversation with the community about some of those goals and what kinds of questions they have. And so the question really guides us to the kind of tool that we'll use and how we can explore that question better. And so some communities have a very specific question, of these 3 buildings, which one makes economic sense for deploying PV or PV plus storage. And some have questions about how solar on certain buildings can contribute to their clean energy goals. So there are a variety of different kinds of questions that these tools can be used to support and help answer those questions. And so really it's about expressing interest to the SolSmart point of contact that you've been working with, or please feel free to reach out to one of us and we can get those conversations started about where you are in the process and how some of this technical support could help you get towards your goals. And at the same time, working on some of these activities like a PV feasibility assessment can actually help you achieve certain SolSmart criteria.
Yep, we saw a couple of those criteria mentioned earlier in the presentation, but they both go a long way in helping cities achieve SolSmart designation and also ideally move the conversation and potential feasibility of solar projects forward as well. So kind of along these lines, another question, as a facilities manager, or I think you could probably throw in, sustainability manager, public works potentially that has a few buildings in a city, what type of data would be useful for me to have up front before I'd run something like the SAM model or the ReApt model or RealFlight, or start having a conversation with NREL? What type of data should I have or be prepared to go look for and find?
Good question. We often have a hard time getting utility bill data, which is the biggest one, right? What is the consumption on that building? So particularly if you're looking at rooftop or net metering a system, you need to know what the consumption is over the course of the year. So not just an annual total, but a monthly bill, and if possible, even more specific than that if you have that data. And utilities sometimes will provide that. So utility bill consumption data is critical. Also, we've spent a long time just trying to figure out exactly what the address and which roof are we trying to so, if you have like a Google Earth snapshot, a picture, and you say, this is the rooftop we're looking at, if you're asking us to do this analysis, so knowing exactly where it is. And Google Earth is a great tool too, where you can just look at and actually measure the size of the roof. And you can also then use that in PV watts to kind of measure it out on a map. So that would be the primary data that you need to start with. Also things like utility rates and time of use rates. If there's a difference there, you can model that in great detail, particularly in SAM. ReApt, we obviously use the more robust version here at NREL. The ReApt Lite might be less sensitive to those different kinds of rate structures. So particularly for a SAM net metered situation, you want to know as much detail about the utility rates for your particular class, right? Is it commercial or is it residential, et cetera? And any time of use or other rates and incentives. So what kinds of incentives might you have through your utility, through the state, et cetera, for those kinds of systems?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, maybe a good thing to do before you start plugging in your energy load data and your rate structures is kind of look at your portfolio of buildings and explore the age of the building, particularly the roof. That will be a very good first cut. So PV systems, it's a 25 to 30-year investment. And so if you think you're going to have to be replacing a roof in 5 years, that might not be a good candidate for these systems. So that can be a good way to kind of cull the long list of buildings that you have. And in addition to that, it would be good to first look at the orientation of the buildings and the roofs, because the buildings that are going to have a south-facing roof, they're going to get the optimal generation from the PV system. So those are kind of two good first cut things to do, and then of course get that additional rate structure, energy load information to start plugging into the model for a site.
That was great. Thank you both for those answers. I actually had a couple of follow-up questions that were answered there, so thank you both. I'm going to give it a few more minutes to see if folks have any other questions. I do want to mention a few things that I also saw come up. We did say early on that SolSmart has a goal of designating 300 communities by October of 2020, and I had mentioned that we're actually over 250 right now, so we're hoping to achieve 300 by this year. And the question was, are we only going to be designating and working with 300 communities, or will we be going above that number? And the answer is we will be going above that number. Hopefully way above that number, since we do have about a year and a half to go. But that was simply the minimum number of designees and communities that we are going to be working with. We'd obviously like to work with a whole heck of a lot more. So if you are interested, don't let that 300 number dissuade you from engaging with SolSmart. And then as usual, the question about the slides and the webinar recording, those will both be posted to the SolSmart website. Usually it does take a couple of days for that information to be posted, but it will be up there. And then we will also, probably next week, send out a follow-up email to this webinar with some additional information. We'll include some links directly to the tools that were mentioned, and also highlight some future upcoming webinars as well. Let me take one more scan here for additional questions. Okay, great question here. The city of Miami is looking to potentially install solar plus storage on 5 parks, community centers, so that they can be used as resilience hubs post-disaster. What tools would be best for determining solar potential at the sites, estimating rough costs, and a return on investment?
Got it. For 5 community centers, and that, if you want to do it yourself, RealFlight may be a good app. I would recommend RealFlight. If you'd like NREL to do it, we would use, well, depending on the sort of analyst who's available and their expertise, we could probably go with either one, SAM or ReApt, the full ReApt model. So I would think if your focus is on resilience, because oftentimes when you model PV plus storage, the economics don't work out to save money, right? But then you have that value of resilience, and so that's often not quantifiable in terms of dollars. So a community needs to understand to what extent do they want to prioritize having a building operational even when the grid goes down. And those are obviously, that may be counted in lives, so that can be very important. So I would take a first cut from your staff if you go that route with RealFlight and look at that modeling. And then if you want to go deeper, either move on to probably SAM, which will be really strong on the financial modeling side and matching up. I mean, you can go as deep as you want into SAM and change all the defaults to look at those time of use rates and when it would be generating, and set all kinds of different parameters as to, when you want the battery to deploy, and perform those resilience functions, or is it something that you want to use to actually balance load and lower kind of rate structures, etc. So that would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you. And another question came through about, do any of the software tools use optimization to determine the system size?
All of them use optimization. That's why we call it ReOpt and BOpt. It is the renewable energy optimization and the building efficiency optimization tool. So they are absolutely going to be optimizing the different scenarios and system configurations to be most efficient and effective and to meet your goals and pricing parameters.
Okay, excellent. All right, that is all the questions we have today. So with that, I'm just going to thank both of our speakers, Megan, Alex. Great as always to have you presenting the NREL tools and participating on the SolSmart webinars. Like I said, we will have a newsletter email that goes out sometime next week with some follow-up information. Keep an eye out for future SolSmart webinars. If you're interested, take a look at the Innovation Awards. And with that, I'm going to close out the webinar. Have a great day, everyone.